Good evening, everybody. Hello. It's so good to see all of you in person. It's good to see the folks that we have joining us online. It's our third hybrid program, and we're still figuring it out. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention something about the weather, because we literally went from winter to summer, the heat of the summer, in about 2 days. So I want to remind you that the Architecture Center is open 7 days a week. All our walking tours are up and running, so to speak, or walking. The river cruise is going, so please go to architecture.org so you can sign up for a tour. Tonight, every time we do a program, it's some kind of milestone. So tonight's milestone is our presenter is from out of town, and it's the first time we've had an out of town presenter in person and online since probably February 2020. So I'm excited about that. And I'm glad to have everybody that's here joining us in person as well. So, of course, I just want to mention about an upcoming program, which is actually a three-parter that we have. Know that many of you participated in our Scully lecture series, which we've done these past 2 years. It's starting again on Tuesday, May 17th. It's going to be all virtual because our speakers are coming from all over the country. But again, it's a three-part series. Reed Kroloff, the IIT Dean of Architecture, is going to be our moderator. And we have 3 different lectures scheduled, and we're looking at the future of architecture from the journalist's point of view, the civil servant's point of view, and then the designer's point of view. So the first lecture, May 17th at 6 o'clock, and Ned Kramer, who used to be the editor-in-chief for the Architect magazine, is our speaker. And then the second lecture is June 8th, also at 6 o'clock. And our civil servants are going to be Maurice Cox, who is the commissioner for the planning department here in Chicago, and Chris Hawthorne, who is the chief of design for the city of Los Angeles, which of course makes me happy since I'm from Los Angeles. And then our designer, and that's going to be in the end of June, June 28th. And you know, I don't have these names memorized, so I got to look at my notes. Is Billy Chen, and she's with Todd Williams, Billy Chen Architects, who designed the Obama Presidential Center. And then Joanna Horn from 5468796, there's no way I would have memorized that, at Architect. That's the name of the firm. And she works primarily with affordability, density, and sustainability. So I want to encourage everyone to join us for those programs. And I also want to mention tonight we're partnering with the Association of Architecture Organizations, AAO, and I want to give a warm welcome. Most of those members are probably joining us on Zoom, so I want to welcome them. And many of them I know will recognize our speaker from his past presentations at our Design Matters conferences. So just a reminder for those of you that are online, you're all muted. We can't see your faces. If you have any tech issues, Ian's there to help, and just put that in the chat. Questions, we'll take them both in person and online, so put those in the Q&A. There's live captioning available online. Just click the thingy, that's a technical term, at the bottom, which says closed captioning. And then you're going to receive, everybody, whether you're in person or online, will receive a recording of today's program within 2 business days, and the link will last 7 days. So I'm not going to talk a lot about Olmsted in my introduction because that's why we have our presenter here, but I did want to mention that, of course, on April 26th, Charles Law Olmsted turned 200. And I know it was a moment, or this whole year is a celebration for landscape architects, park aficionados, preservationists, and the public, because Olmsted, of course, is credited for at least 100 parks and park systems. And everyone seems to have a Olmsted park that they love, whether it's here in Chicago, it was the World's Fair of 1893, Central Park in New York, Prospect Park in Brooklyn, Jackson Park in Chicago, the Emerald Necklace in Boston. Those are the top ones. I know we'll go in deeper dive And of course, after 2.5 years of a pandemic, the public appreciates park spaces more than ever. And an interesting thing about Olmsted, of course, is that he created a space for nature within an urban environment. And we want to remember that nature existed before the park, and there were people here who are still here today. So I want to introduce our speaker. In the publicity for tonight's program, we mentioned that Olmsted was a designer, an educator, an advocate, an activist, an innovator. And as I was preparing my remarks tonight, I realized that we can actually say the exact same thing about Charles Birnbaum. He's really dedicated his life's work to parks, public spaces, and preservation. And he's an educator, a scholar, an advocate, a designer, and an activist. He's the president, CEO, and founder of the Cultural Landscape Foundation, founded in 1998. It connects people and spaces, and I know he'll talk more about that a little bit. Prior to this, he worked at the National Park Service Historic Landscape Initiative. He's written and edited dozens of publications and was a frequent contributor to HuffPost. He was a Loeb Fellow at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, a recipient of the Rome Prize, and he's received numerous, not just one, awards and honors from the American Society of Landscape Architects. That's just a little glimpse of who our speaker is tonight, and so I want to encourage you when you go home, look him up because you'll learn a lot more. But now it's really my great honor to invite Charles to come up and share his wisdom with us.
Okay, my understanding is the other mic was not cooperating, so we're going to go for the full Oprah handheld device. It's great to be here this evening. And Hallie, I just want to shout out to you. It's been really wonderful to get to know you in this process. You are a whirling dervish and you make everything happen, so thank you to you. It's exciting to be here to talk about Olmsted and to really, I think, broaden our perception of Olmsted. One of the things that people sometimes say to me is, do you miss practice? And I say, what are you talking about? How do you define practice? And what I've come to understand in working on tonight's lecture is that Olmsted was as much an activist as he was anything else. And what's all the more astonishing is what he would advocate for over the course of a single year. And I'll give you a little taste of that this evening. I also believe that there is Olmsted in all of us, hence the title, and how we have to unlock this. And one need not be a landscape architect to think about how Olmsted resides inside of us. What I do know is we have to get away from the stereotypes, the sort of Olmsted is Santa Claus photo that always seems to be the image because it's in the public domain. There's also the Olmsted with the hot cheekbones and the really awesome Greek sailor hat that was also ripped off from Olmsted by Zorba the Greek and the Beatles. And so, a little bit headier, I would say this is my Fred talk, and how this Fred talk will reveal how the love of Olmsted resides in all of us. And what's interesting to me about Olmsted Senior is that this love, this appreciation, begins during his active career. Mrs. Schuyler Van Rensselaer, for example, published in Art Out of Doors, which was first published in the 1890s and republished in the 1920s, that she compared Olmsted's work at Central Park as rivaling any of the art that hung on the walls of the Metropolitan. I've had the good fortune to know a number of people who have been great mavericks in the discipline. One of them, for example, is Larry Halperin. Larry's office had this bas-relief of Mr. Olmsted hanging over his desk. This was a little bookmark that I discovered on one of my visits to his residence. And you can see that Olmsted had his place along with all of his Judeo ephemera. In reflecting on the FDR Memorial, Larry Halperin noted, and so with all of that, we decided to go and get some granite, and I figured that the best kind of granite would be ones that would be similar to the color of the granite that was in Manhattan in Central Park. that had to be done by Mr. Olmsted. And that made me feel good because it felt like Olmsted was included along with the Roosevelt Memorial. If we think about Larry looking at Yosemite, he talks about, I won't read this quote, he talks about how that Olmsted was just there and it was not really a conscious stroke, if you will, as a designer. We could see Larry Halperin in the middle under the lamp in the back, and here he is with a young office employee, Rich Haig, who also reflected in our oral history with him about Mr. Olmsted, bemoaning the kind of change to those landscapes and saying, change is inevitable. It's like my old father used to say, ain't nothing wrong with progress, it just goes on too long. And here he is mentoring a very young Laurie Olin. And Laurie notes that he has heroes. Well, because of his social vision, because of his understanding of the relationship of the people to the environment and health, and to his ability to get things done. He was the General Eisenhower of landscape architecture. He notes Olmsted was a genius, not just because he figured out how to get things done, he was a genius because he saw how cities were going to grow and what their needs were environmentally. Olmsted saw that the city was the problem, and he saw how to deal with it, and he worked to the scale of the problem. It's also interesting to me that a number of the women that came into their own during a period of modernism, like Carol Johnson and Cornelia Oberlander, they came to Olmsted through the firm's campus design works. Carol Johnson notes, for example, that she realized that Wellesley College was the first designed landscape that she had ever lived in consciously, whereas both of them recognized the careful manipulation of scenery and the placement of buildings on those seven sister colleges. Our work at the foundation, as Hallie noted, is about connecting people to places. The work that we do is sort of 3 steps: make visible, instill value, engage the public. This year we're having a spotlight on Mr. Olmsted. We've just launched a digital guide to Olmsted's landscapes through our What's Out There program. We also have lifted the veil on 100 people plus that either worked for or with the Olmsted practice. And what's been exciting about this is most of these names are not names that we're familiar with. And I'll also touch a little bit on that tonight about a lot of avenues for further research. Our landslide program this year will be dedicated to Olmsted design landscapes. We'll unveil that in the fall. And right before that activity, we're rolling out on September 27th, a new book called Experiencing Olmsted. It's the first, to the best of my knowledge, guidebook to over 200 Olmsted design landscapes throughout North America, to be published by Timber Press. And then finally, our Oberlander Prize. The namesake is the late, great Cornelia Oberlander, who passed away sadly last year of COVID, 6 weeks shy of her 100th birthday. And our first laureate, Julie Bargman, will be the subject of this year's public engagement activities. I promise that's my only infomercial tonight. So let me tell you about what I'd like to do this evening. I'm going to sort of, in the first 2 parts of this talk, look at the Olmsted movement. As I mentioned, that this is a time for landscape activism. And the question is, what can we learn from the Olmsted movement over the last 50, 60 years? And then the third part of my presentation, we'll look at avenues for reassessment and moving forward. So part 1. When I look back to when this movement sort of starts, it really starts to take hold in 1963. It's the centennial of the use of the term landscape architect in the revised Greensward Plan at Harvard University under the landscape historian Al Fine. Many of the others that worked on that work, for example, like Julius Fabo shown here, went on to illustrious careers. It was also the very same year that the Olmsted property Fairstead became a national National Historic Site. It was not owned by the Park Service at that time, so it was still quite vulnerable. The Harvard exhibition itself also began to spill out into the larger discipline of landscape architecture, and we see these books coming out of Al Fine's work on that exhibition. On the left, we have Landscape into Cityscape, which was a collection of Olmsted's writings, and then a newer book that he published on the American environmental tradition. The work from the exhibition became the book that you see in the middle, and the work of Julius Fabos and others. And then finally, in 1964, An American Farmer in England was republished. So this is the beginning of this sort of reawakening of Olmsted. Here in Chicago, I was intrigued to see that as early as 1966, there was a special supplement in the Hyde Park Herald. This was given to me by the great landscape architect Bill Johnson of Johnson Johnson Roy when we were doing our oral history with him. And what was interesting to me, I'm not going to read the quotes here, but I was intrigued at this idea that at that point, there was a great concern about the edge and what the edge of the park means. And I couldn't help but look at this interview we did with him in 2015 in the context of the discourse that went around more recently about the confiscation of public parkland for the Obama Presidential Center. It's also in the 60s that we start to see Landscape Architecture magazine get in the game. They start publishing book reviews for the books that I just showed you. It's intriguing to me also that this review in 1969 was written by the late Dr. Charles McLaughlin, who was the founder of the Frederick Law Olmsted Papers. On one hand, he's incredibly enthusiastic about Olmsted getting back in there, and he says, these new books have brought a bewildering array of source material to the general reader. With them on our shelf, we will be much closer to an informed appreciation of Olmsted's great accomplishments. 3 years after this, we have a major exhibition coming to Washington, D.C. and to New York as part of the Olmsted Sesquicentennial. Here we have J. Carter Brown, who was the director of the National Gallery at the time, referring to Olmsted as one of America's most prescient and sensitive artists. The pair of shows that opened concurrently in New York and in Washington, D.C., the book on the top for the New York show was written by a young Betsy Barlow. So this is over 50 years ago this year that this was published as a companion catalog, if you will. What I love is Ada Louise Huxtable's review in the New York Times basically suggests if this doesn't make Olmsted a rock star, these two shows, we're going to need Charlton Heston to play him in the movies. So again, when we think about this Olmsted Renaissance, to think this is starting as early as the 60s and the 70s. Here's a brochure, for example, from the Washington, D.C. exhibition. Both of these were curated by Bill Alex. The other thing that happens in 72 is the Frederick Law Olmsted Papers are inaugurated by McLaughlin and Beveridge, and this is, of course, at Johns Hopkins. 73, we see the publication of Frederick Law Olmsted biography. Thank you for the laugh, Julia Backrack. Olmsted with an A. I don't know if you noticed the Hyde Park Herald story also had throughout, Olmsted was spelled with an A throughout there. But what's incredible to me, for those here that are in the profession and they look at their own body of work, are you archiving your work? Will the work have a future after your office? The Olmstead Collections you could see here in 1972, or excuse me, pardon me, 1977, we have 27,000 items measuring 28.8 linear feet that were made available on 60 rolls of microfiche. We also had John Charles Olmsted's collection, so this is Olmsted's stepson, nephew, going to Harvard's Loeb Library. So this work starts to find its way out into public access. And then finally, Fairstead is still here, but it's sort of languishing still at this time. It's hard to believe this is what Fairstead looked like in the 1970s. The images on the right are from 1977. I have here 2 interviews that we did with Stu Dawson and Ed Dougherty. Dougherty was an intern in that office for just a few weeks. Ed is in his 90s in Atlanta, retired. And they both talked about when they were at Harvard that this was really not on anybody's radar, other really than in a romantic sense for people like Norman Newton and Stanley White. But it wasn't a pilgrimage site that you went as a student at Harvard to go to Fairstead. So that's kind of the first era. The second era, and I said the Olmsted and all of us, so I have to show everyone that's me with my David Cassidy hair at the Forestry School at Syracuse. Yes, I did have hair, so that's the second thing you'll learn tonight. But in 1980, we had field trips, and we went to New York. I was a New Yorker to begin with, so I was, as a young person, aware, although I didn't know the proper name for them, the heavenly happenings that were happening to get people into the park. And then as a young person, I did a lot of these things. I wasn't at Barbra Streisand. That was just lore when I was a little kid, but I remember the parents talking about it. But I did, spend the day waiting to get my tickets for Pirates of Penzance, um, and I was very familiar with Nina Simone's music growing up. But the park was really so much a part of my life. And as sort of a cinemaphile, for those of you that know me, um, we carry these memories with us. When we try to understand the love of Olmsted that we all carry, these landscapes have penetrated our lives in so many different ways, both physically, emotionally, and then through arts and culture, that we love them. And by extension, those that often created those places. So I want to kind of pull back from New York for a moment and say, in 1980, all of this really just sort of explodes. We have Fairstead is acquired by the National Park Service. We have the creation of a national organization, the National Association for Olmsted Parks, who are leading the Olmsted 200 charge this year. And then the Central Park Conservancy was founded. This was seismic in terms of manifesting change within the legacy, not just in New York, but across the country. In New York City the following year, Art of the Olmsted Landscape was curated. The publication was edited by Mary Ellen Hearn, and one of the essays was written again by Mr. Fine, noting since the 50s, Olmsted had emerged from relative obscurity. Olmsted's varied contributions as a theorist, planner, designer, and administrator are relevant to the needs of the nation today. What gives the Olmsted's Renaissance special dimension is that so many of his original creations, though badly in need of maintenance and repair, are still mostly intact and vital to the communities surrounding them. Olmsted's Renaissance, therefore, derives from the continuing relevance of his work and the ideas on which those efforts were based. With one exception here, these are all photos that I took in the 1980s. You might recognize the two Chicago views on the right-hand side. The top right, of course, is the Midway Plaisance. The bottom left is Washington Park. I was staying with friends in Greektown. I took public transportation there, and I was almost mugged and had my camera almost stolen, but I didn't, and it was incredible. But that's what that park looked like then. And I don't think people know that this is what our parks look like. We forget that there was these places were abandoned by their stewards because they didn't have the resources to care for them. But yet, this love is prevalent. So in this period, we have first the two Charlies with the National Association for Olmsted Parks, Dr. Beveridge and Dr. McLaughlin, who then did so much research. We're also an inspiration and acoustical guides for many on these trips. The view on the right, for example, was here in Illinois. It was when the NAOP went to Riverside, and you can see Dr. McLaughlin on the front waving and Dr. Beveridge both on the far left. And this is a really interesting time because this sort of ragtag coalition of people were scholars, landscape architects, planners, lawyers, but a lot of homemakers who were people that lived in communities that were disturbed about what their parks looked like, and they wanted to make a difference. These are some photographs that I took on some of those trips, and it's kind of hard to believe this is Seattle and Louisville, Kentucky in the 1980s. This is how renegade parking was dealt with in Seattle on the left. And I want to pause for a moment here, because when I talk about the Olmsted in me, and some of you may know, for example, Irma Tranter on the top right, and in the bottom row, second in on the left, is Vicky Rani. These were extraordinary women. Arlene Levy in the sort of blue turtleneck leaping out at you in the foreground here, who's a great friend and a mentor to me of many, many decades. When I asked her about this as a scholar and a mother, and an activist, she said, we weren't burning our bras, but we were looking for an experience that was both rewarding individually and collectively. And as a 20-something with a big head of hair, I was taken under the wing of all of these extraordinary women. And I came through them to understand what acts of activism are. And that to be a practitioner in this field meant that you had to stand up for the resources and you had to have a position to ensure their stewardship going forward. So I really dedicate this lecture to this evening to all of these extraordinary women. And what's remarkable is, think about this, in just 4 years, they're hitting Capitol Hill. Many of you may know Patricia O'Donnell. She's in the bottom image on the lower right-hand side. Gail Gillette were testifying before Congress with others for the Olmsted Act. It ultimately didn't pass, but what was incredible to me was the tenacity and the vision and the gumption to go forward. And then for the landscape architects that are here, all of this work then became work for the discipline. We had under Dukakis $12 million for 12 parks. We had the 5 sections of the Prospect Park reports. I had the good fortune of working with Patricia O'Donnell and the late Anthony Walmsley, shown here. On the right-hand side, the Prospect Park work and the Emerald Necklace work was with both of them, where I got to work as a landscape architect as well as being an advocate. And then from these groups came hundreds of others of grassroots organizations that would be created that would advance the stewardship values for these parks and these collections of open spaces. So if we were to look back at this, if I were to give sort of a formula, if you begin with a foundation of love, and you have all of these advocates, and you have the scholarship, and you have the resources at your access, it is the necessary foundation for a movement. And I think there's a good model to be followed here in terms of other resource typologies. And at the end of the day, if you don't write about these places, there isn't going to be the foundations for the movement. And we see this with Olmsted. We see this at a national scale, not just the Olmsted papers, but the diversity of works that have been produced over this time. Individual monographs dedicated to individual resources going deeper contextually, traveling exhibitions, children's books. I have a hard time even defining these types of books because they're so innovative in their approach. I mean, Devil in the White City is fiction based on fact. Clearing in the Distance is fact with conjectural fiction. And Saving Central Park is an autobiography about a person and place in equal measure. It's extraordinary to me that the work elicits such creative responses. Postage stamps, documentaries, and public broadcasting. And then, of course, there's Olmsted's writing himself. So the body of knowledge in this particular case is truly unrivaled. When NAOP was founded, one of my heroes was Grady Clay. Grady Clay was the first urban affairs editor for a major newspaper in an American city, the Louisville Courier-Journal. And he was asked to give a paper at an early NAOP conference. And he notes, "I was wrong-headed enough to think some years back this well-meaning little enterprise would flutter into public view and then disappear among that host of good causes that never get anywhere. How wrong could I be? Quite contrary to what I expected, the movement mushroomed beyond that tiny, scholarly, and rather elitist New England crowd, as I had perceived it, among whom it exercised its original spell. It was all quite inspiring. I felt I was present at the moment the whole thing had finally achieved critical mass and would become a movement." If you look at nothing else to recognize how all of this research and scholarship and the availability of those resources are impactful, these are, and there are others that are not here, these were all of the National Register designated Olmsted landscapes in America that I can find. And you'll notice that this page is just A through C. And I don't have time to unpack all of these, but I would conjecture this evening that there is not an American designer in American history that is represented on the National Register of Historic Places more than the legacy of Olmsted and his successor firms. It's mind-boggling. And these nominations happened. The dates are here because you could actually look at the publications that preceded them, that became the critical contextual analysis for people to put forward those nominations. These pages here, these are National Historic Landmarks. So keep in mind that in the first case, there's about 84,000 National Register properties. Here, there's only about 2,800 National Historic Landmarks. It's extraordinary. So with that is sort of a reflection on what has happened to date. I'd like to look forward now. And this is sort of, although I never think we should do 12-step programs, these are sort of the things about Olmsted looking forward. The first one is the easiest. It is fun to do a Google search under Olmsted with an A and see how fruitful it can be, and even in recent postings. But these next two images, these are actually in the Olmsted Collections. And so this is not a new issue. The Olmsteds had good fun with this problem during their tenure. For those that know Lawrence Halperin's super graphics, I thought it was interesting that the Olmsted office also had the big pointy finger that we know from, I guess, Monty Python as well. This is awesome. This is actually when the Olmsted property was listed on the National Register. And so, you know, sticking to tradition, I guess, they decided to slip in Olmsted with an A. And, you know, you can just sort of find it on any given day. There's always Olmsted with an A. But there was also more than one. And I think here in Chicago, a lot of folks know that there was more than one. We know that he did look tired, but he didn't live from 1822 to 1957. But, you know, the reality is there were others. You know, there was John Charles Olmsted, the stepson, and there was Olmsted Junior. Now here's a brain teaser. Did you know that there was a sister in between there? Marion Olmsted. We don't know a lot about Marion. Good avenue for future research. We know she did some drawings for Felsted, where Olmsted was briefly very late in his life. But there was also a sister. And the thing I always wonder about with these guys, so here's Olmsted Junior in the middle out in the Pacific Northwest. Here's, I'm sorry, that was John Charles, pardon me. And this is, of course, Olmsted Junior. This is one of my favorite Olmsted Brothers landscapes. This is at the Cleveland Museum of Art in Wade Park in Cleveland. And then there is, of course, the family tree. The thing that I always wonder about is, why don't I ever see a photo of the three of them together? I mean, why do I look at the Kirk Douglas and his family, but I don't get to do this for the Olmsteds? It's just confounding. But I think this idea of lifting the veil on all of these people in a century of practice is essential. And I think there's been great strides made. For example, the sort of celadon color here are the two last employees, Joe Hudak and Artemis Partridge Richardson, who were part of Olmsted Associates. I do love even this last chapter that goes through the 60s, where you can see they're wrestling with font. Like, are we really hip and modern, or are we sort of a legacy company? So we have this sort of compromise of type fonts, of Times New Roman, serif, and then something that's sort of a Helvetica Light. Okay, but in all seriousness, this idea of Olmsted as a reformer, this to me is the most mind-boggling thing in the world. So it's 1863. A few years earlier, Olmsted and Vaux win the Central Park competition. In 1863, they get those extra 4 blocks to extend Central Park to the plan that we know it as through 110th Street. In that very same year, Olmsted delivers a paper in New York that leads to the creation of the Nation publication, a plea for independent journalism, 1863. Also in 1863, you can see here how he was just a real slacker. He publishes another paper on the conditions in hospitals and our war veterans. It leads and contributes to the creation of the American Red Cross. This is 1 year for Olmsted, the landscape architect. The other thing that's interesting, and you'll see a pattern here, I'm going to give you tastes of things that my hope is that it excites people to do this research. I think we've done a lot to look at Olmsted, looking at the Cotton Kingdom and slavery in the South through Sarah Zowdy and others. But what's interesting to me, even before that was published, in Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England, This is now in 1852. We could see that Olmsted is wrestling with the perceptions of being an American abroad and the perception of coming from the United States where there are slaveholders. This is fertile ground for future research. Now, Olmsted, the advocate activist. This is one of my favorite, if you guys have never read this, for the landscape architects that are here, Google Spoils of the Park. I have this fantasy that, Michael Van Valkenburg comes back to New York in 10 years, and he's not pleased with the maintenance and management at Brooklyn Bridge Park. And so he takes to writing a pamphlet, a paper, calling out the municipalities. Now, of course, we wouldn't do this today, but look at Olmsted, how fearless. This disorganized body has been masquerading before the public, a headless trunk without policy, without order, without well-defined purpose. He calls them out. I think this quote is just tweet-worthy today. I think it would really pack a punch. He's also curating his efforts. When he goes with elected officials, with the Yosemite commissioners, with Congress people, he brings a Chinese chef to prepare the meals. He is reading his report to them in the wilderness. They're being seduced by nature and Olmsted's vision. I won't read these quotes, but what I find so enticing about these is to see this idea of conservation, preservation of natural and cultural value inherent so early on. I live in Washington, D.C., and I hadn't realized of Olmsted's sort of efforts as an advocate for Rock Creek Park to make sure that we maintained a dignified arrival experience to the nation's capital. And so here it is, the Capitol grounds are being enhanced, and Olmsted saying, wait a minute, guys, the city's spreading out, this farmland is vulnerable, it needs to be put in public trust. That's exactly what happened. The same with the Niagara Reservation. Having regard to the enjoyment of visitors of natural scenery and considering that the means of making this enjoyment available to large members of them will unavoidably lessen the extent and the value of the primary elements of natural scenery. And he says, nothing of artificial character should be allowed a place on the property. He also publishes in places like Scribner's and The Century about the need to protect and enhance our waterfronts throughout our American cities, as he sees places like St. Louis, Norwalk, Virginia, becoming more industrialized. The plan on the bottom left, by the way, is of course here in Chicago. Olmsted the bureaucrat. As someone who spent 15 years in the federal government, I want to reclaim that word. It was slalom, it was never a straight line, but good work could be done. And Olmsted was aware of that. This is the only contemporary quote that I'll read to you this evening. It was published in the New Yorker in 2020 by Matt Dellinger, but I think it really resonates today. Whether scenic beauty or war, hospital or park, Olmsted believed that we were all in this together, like it or not. In union, and this is now quoting Olmsted, in union is strength, in disunion is weakness and waste. Can we not, in this trial of our nation, learn to wholly lay aside that poor disguise of narrowness of purpose and self-conceit, which takes the name of local interest and public spirit? Olmsted, the inventor of new landscape typologies. I defy anyone here to tell me a landscape architect that has invented more landscape types than Olmsted. I did want to put this on the front end because to me, this is just one of my favorite Olmsted firm landscapes in Chicago. To me, it's this sort of extraordinary Beaux-Arts plan that is got 1 foot there and 1 foot in the picturesque. I think that this should be a National Historic Landmark because of its uniqueness within the canon of Olmsted's work. And like other National Historic Landmarks that have been bestowed in this city due to the good efforts of Julia Bachrach, who's here with us this evening, in Columbus Park and at the Lily Pool. Julia, I think this would be the trifecta. But more generally speaking, Olmsted invented the Parkway with Calvert Box in Buffalo, first in Brooklyn, New York, with the 6,600 linear feet Eastern Parkway. He invented the park system. Of course, the Emerald Necklace is best known. I would argue that the Emerald Necklace is a potential World Heritage Site as the first urban greenway in the world, as a progenitor of a typology. Olmsted and Vox in Buffalo, the Olmsted Brothers in Seattle. I thought for fun, rather than show the South Park plan that we all know well, to see the other plan that the Olmsted Brothers did here for the smaller parks, which are an incredible assemblage of public spaces. Olmsted invented the ecologically performative landscape. Think about the Back Bay Fens when that was created between 1879 and 1892. Olmsted with Charles Eliot created the scenic reservation, laying lightly on the land, wilder and less manipulated than urban parks. The constructed elements in reservations are kept minimal. The design flourishes might be termed cohesive or naturalistic. A lot of people don't know the Garden State, New Jersey, has an incredible collection of reservations. It also boasts only the first municipal countywide park system in the US. But here, for example, is Eagle Rock Reservation. You can see what the view was like historically, and then we've more recently plopped down memorials right in the primary view shed. So in complete contradiction to the concept of a scenic reservation. Olmsted was an innovator, expanding the purview of the landscape architect. I love when I look at Olmsted projects to see how intellectually greedy the firm could be, that they recognize that the landscape architect is the orchestrator and the facilitator. Here in Mountain Lake, Florida, for example, every single detail, the building footprints, the construction documents, the roof details, the awnings, the paint colors, the signage, the lighting fixtures, not just outside, but also inside, the design of fruit crates, all designed by the Olmsted practice. In Washington, D.C., before the architect was giving form to building architecture at the National Cathedral, they were doing shadow studies to see the impact of the masses on the cathedral grounds. In Rochester, New York, before engineers were hired to design bridges to straddle the Genesee River, they were doing the super elevations and the conceptual sketches for what those bridges would look like. This is an incredible drawing. I don't know if it was even built, but it's for bears that was barless in New Orleans Audubon Park. This is decades before the work of Jones and Jones. And then, of course, civic art and a furnishings palette for these places, beginning, of course, with Central Park, but then seeing so much nuance in so many of these projects in terms of the site furnishings. I wanted to show these from the South Parks because, to me, what's extraordinary here, even in all of the sort of grit of the Industrial Revolution, to see such civic ambition in the design and the form giving of these places. You know, none of this came off of a shelf. Everything was nuanced and site specific. I think one of the more interesting areas in terms of contemporary practice today in revisiting Olmsted is seeing how the firm redefined what the memorial landscape can be. This is a rather interesting drawing and does explain a lot why we're having rising tides in the tidal basin and why we've recently seen all of these environmental challenges. We can see here in the Olmsted office that this was all filled in. But beyond the sort of landscape that I think people know well in Washington, there's also the work in Kansas City. And then there are these gestures that we don't see in any of our textbooks. The Laura Spellman Rockefeller Memorial in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, you can see how this was carved into the landscape. And the commemorative experience is one of a borrowed view that you are afforded through a dignified arrival experience. And again, because of its setting, you could see this kind of use of natural materials laying lightly on the land and being cohesive in its surgical insertion. This is another project that was built. I've not seen this myself. And the drawing on the right was by Arthur Shercliffe, who was with the office. Charles Eliot, when he died tragically young and was so much a mentor and an influence to many in the office, this memorial was created in one of the scenic reservations that Eliot was involved in. This is the Blue Hills Reservation, and you can see symbolically it's a bridge, and it is a landscape feature like the Spellman Memorial, which is not dominating the landscape, but contributing to its quality and character. And then an entire park as the memorial in Jacksonville, Florida. This is a war memorial without having any sort of military pageantry. It's another Beaux-Arts design, very simple. It was listed on the National Register a couple of years ago. And then number 8, Olmsted the Mentor. And this is really fertile ground. Some of these people in the last decade have had books written about them, like Arthur Shercliffe. These are his before and after drawings that he did for his vegetation management study with the Olmsted practice. Warren Manning, William Lyman Phillips, all of these have been the subject of monographs. But then there were others that, and it's interesting because this happens in the early 20th century where the Olmsted firm strategically places their people. So for example, in Portland, Oregon, E.T. Meesh, who was with the office, goes out there to become the superintendent. And under his direction from 1908 to 1914, many of the parks that were proposed by the Olmsted firm are designed and built by Meesh. In fact, this plan that you see here looks like an Olmsted drawing, but it's actually a Meesh drawing for Laurelhurst Park. And I can't tell you a lot about a lot of these people. They're all in our new Olmsted Guide, many of them. But for example, you see here Jones and Langdon and Perkins that all go on to Washington. So for example, Langdon did drawings with Olmsted Senior on the Muddy River. Then he goes to Washington and he's doing all of these drawings like the one that you see in the middle here for the Rock Creek Parkway. And so although his name is on it and he's the principal designer, we know that he was traveling back to the Olmsted office to meet with Junior for extended periods of time. So the sort of tentacles of the firm really reach out beyond the office itself through these people that then begin to cycle through the office, many of who we really still know very little about. In terms of expanding the legacy beyond the people, there's also a great number of landscape typologies that are really great opportunities for future research. Olmsted and the HBCUs, the Historic Black Colleges, and the Southern Colleges. Here, for example, is the work that the firm was doing at Fisk University with David Williston. Williston's drawing that you see on the bottom right below his portrait is actually in the collections at Fairstead. So there was a back and forth that was going on here. There's also a great number of Southern College campuses, all the way through Olmsted Associates. Many of these campuses exist to a large degree today, and they're below the radar in terms of awareness for Olmsted. There's a handful of cemeteries as well that are below the radar. People don't think of Olmsted as being, and the firm as being cemetery designers for the most part. And then there are places where there are just great parks that are ripe for reappraisal. This is Kirby Park in Wilkes-Barre, and if you look at an aerial, much of it exists today. There are places like the Yeoman's Hall Club in Charleston. Again, if you start looking at Google Maps, there's a very high degree of integrity from the earlier designs. And as far north as Vancouver, Calgary, this is the uplands. This is a really interesting plan. You can see the kind of Beaux-Arts spinal column running through the middle. But then there were areas where the Olmsted firm is noting that there were native peoples and there were cultural lifeways associated with the site, and those were respected in the Olmsted scheme. Now, in terms of the office itself, there's an opportunity here to expand the contextual lens beyond all of these guys. These are some of the cartoons that you can find in the office, and I've always wondered about how this whole office functioned. Who were these other people? that allowed Olmsted and his successors to do the work they were doing. This is an interesting image, and the typo is not mine, it's on the card itself. It says it's taken from the men's lunchroom. And I have to wonder, where did the women have lunch? Did they have a lunchroom? Did they eat at their desk? We should know that. This is an interesting holiday card from 1932-33. Notice all of the signatures. Now, Edward Clark Whiting is the second one from the bottom, but this looks like a lot of women. Who were these people? Helen Bullard, who, when I asked Arlene Levy about her, who's always my Olmsted Sherpa, I know she's with us remotely, so a little shout out to Arlene tonight. I said, are there any photos of Helen Bullard? And she said, I've never seen a photo of her, but you can always identify her by her bustle and her bun. And certainly that silhouette is Helen Bullard. She was the highest compensated female employee with the practice. This is another one of those kind of stories where I thought, I've seen this photo many times at Palos Verdes. And you can't help but notice, who's the skirt? Who is this? Well, this was Stella Obst. She was a Wellesley College graduate. She was hired by the firm in 1913 and worked with Junior for 4 decades. This is a story just waiting to be unpacked. When I was working on the Olmsted, the Experiencing Olmsted book this past year, I was going through thousands and thousands of images. And you would come across photos such as these. Who's the gentleman on the left that was engaged at Biltmore in some capacity? I don't know what a natterlily is. If anyone does, I would welcome that knowledge. The 3 people in the foreground are Olmsted associates, and I do know that William Bell Marquist is in the center. This is the Bradley Estate, which is the Bradley Museum in Columbus. It's open to the public. You could go there. And clearly, this is the team that built that landscape. There's a story here. It's also interesting, as someone that had been, when I was in the private sector, I had worked on Druid Hill Park and other Baltimore parks, and more recently went back to look at these as part of the middle branch. You read the Olmsted reports, like the first one from 1904, and it says, the public parks being the property of the people shall be open to all persons upon absolutely equal terms. But then you learn that the parks were segregated then. This is an interesting drawing, and it's signed off by Olmsted Junior. You'll notice there are 2 swimming pools, not one. One is labeled for black children, and the other is labeled for white children. It's drawn by Percy Jones, who we saw in the group photo earlier. So, to me, this is also in the context of an annual report that was published in the prior decade. This is even more disturbing. This is actually a working print. This is from the era of when the Olmsteds come back in the 20s, so this is under Junior. And you'll notice that the slums are being differentiated between white and black areas. Now, these are the kinds of plans that should be analyzed in terms of what ultimately was put forth as part of the expansion of the system over time. And then there are these fascinating images in places like the Everglades. First, I'll say I don't know what impact the Olmsteds had on the Everglades. There were 55 plans in the files from this period. This is Olmsted Junior on the trip, and he took a lot of photos because he had a new Leica camera, and you'll notice that they're labeled Leica. So he was getting to know his camera. And this is just one of the photos in the file. So I haven't read the correspondence, I haven't read any of the reports, but again, this is fertile terrain. But what I can tell you is very often there is a profound sensitivity to recognizing and calling out extant ethnographic fabric. The image on the top left is on the LSU campus, and it is labeled Indian Mound. We know from the work in Grant Park in Atlanta that there was a profound respect for all of the earlier earthworks, including those military earthworks. I mean, you can see there was even a proposed cyclorama. So we know from the Canadian project, we know from these projects, but I don't think folks have really done the research to look at the cultural value that was assigned these types of resources by the Olmsted practice. There's been more done in cities like Charleston and Newport, where there was a calling out of those scenic and historic values. And then Olmsted, the innovator in practice, if you will, laying the ground for a contemporary practice. Did they invent the title block that has all of these signatures? I mean, we take these kinds of things for granted, but were they the first? Until someone tells me otherwise, I think they were probably the first landscape architects to professionalize in such a way. Were they the first to stage photography? Think of all of the celebrated landscape photographers that we all work with in the discipline today. The Olmsteds were hiring these people. Here in Chicago, for example, I don't know who J.W. Taylor was, but he was frequently in their employ, and I'm guessing that that photo on the left is staged in the same way that the one on the cover of the Riverway was, because as Cynthia Zajewski, the historian, once told me, you wouldn't have a boat there that water was not navigable. So these are staged. This is interesting to see how they're using photography to solve problems and to execute schematic designs. This is a really interesting drawing that I recently found, where you can see a historic wall is serving as an example for new wall construction that's going to be done. This is in the Wyman Park Dell in Baltimore. Pre-Photoshop, we have the introduction of a new monument and sort of putting it into different design motifs in Baltimore. And I guess the question I want to know is, were the Olmsteds the first to do multiple alternatives? We take for granted in practice today, you know, oh, well, we'll do 3 schematics and we'll take them to the community. Usually, I think we know what we want to advance, and we try to get people to share the vision. The Olmsteds were doing this very early on. And what's also incredible to me is to see the level of design exploration that can happen for the smallest of features. This was actually built in Cherokee Park. Here, for example, at the Corning Fountain in Hartford, here we have a scale model. Then you can see we're looking at, well, is this going to be a jet? Is this going to be sculptural? What is this going to be? And then to be able to indulge, look at the coping explorations. I mean, what a luxury to explore the design of a singular feature to such a high level of detail. Innovation in moving large trees. The engineer, John Yap Collier was the one that developed this tree moving device. I love this ladder for tree pruning. And how about this bug pole? This is also something that Arlene Levy brought to my attention, where in Mountain Lake, Florida, Olmsted could get up to a height to survey the land, but to also get up above, I'm guessing, the mosquito population. Tree reports in cities like Baltimore and DC for scientific value, for beauty, for form, really would, in many cases, hold their own with contemporary standards, very prescriptive. We think about the deer problem today. Well, so the Olmsteds were dealing with it in 1927 at Yosemite. So this is not new. And in Rochester, New York, along the reconfigured water bodies along the edges, they were marking those native plants that should be protected and replanted. And so in these images, you see the Olmsteds marking where the new elevations will be and which trees and understory should be relocated and recycled in their design. This is extraordinary for its time. And then finally, in closing, I can stand before you tonight and I can be in your Zoom room at home or in your office because of this archive. I'm kind of blown away when I look back and see what the condition of the archive was when Fairstead transferred its ownership and the drawings and all of its correspondence. To go to Fairstead today for a landscape architect is the equivalent of going to a holy shrine. It is an extraordinary resurrection of a place, which is where the discipline of landscape architecture was largely invented. When I went to the Park Service, Dr. Ernest Connolly, and this was in 1992, he was already retired and would make occasional appearances. And I didn't know that he was actually someone that reviewed Fairstead when it was being looked at for a Park Service site. And he said, it's a good opportunity for a new kind of National Historic Site, like a study center, not the usual museum, no interpretation in the usual sense, building and contents of highest importance. So tonight's lecture has been brought to you because this all exists. It's incredible. 6,000 projects, 138,000 plans, 100,000 photographs, 70,000 plant lists. The Frederick Law Olmsted papers, 173,000 items. If you go on Flickr and look at the Olmsted archives, I typed this in on May 10th. There's now more than 198,000 images that have been digitized that are just a click away. If you're curious about Olmsted and his legacy, it is just clicks away. I guess in closing, I should say that this was my Fred talk. And, you know, it's so strange to, I'm going to just speak very personally for a moment. You know, as I look out on friends that I've known for many decades, who I've traveled within a discipline with in different cities, on different journeys, with shared values and shared missions. But what's just so extraordinary today is when all of this began to conserve these places, the landscape architects were the parsley around the roast in cities like Chicago. You know, Joe Carr was the only game in town. And you look at the places that are the most cherished in a city like Chicago today, and they're all parks and open spaces. And whether it's something that's been created in the last 10 or 25 years or more than 100 years ago, the role of the landscape architect in shaping cities and in advocating for the possibility to do that is just extraordinary. And what's so wonderful is to be here at the Chicago Architecture Foundation, where I will do a little call out on your introductory video where you say landscape design in the great room, and you know someone needs to edit that to be landscape architects. But I want to thank CAF for inviting me tonight. I want to thank those of us that have come out masked and unmasked to be with each other to celebrate the bicentennial of the birth of Olmsted. Thank you very much.
I won't lie, it's nice to hear some clapping.
It is better than booze.
Always. So do we have any questions here? We have a couple of questions on Zoom. So I'm going to walk over, and at the same time, I'm going to ask the question from Steve. He's saying, are cities and towns using Olmsted connections to contract tourism and spur civic revival?
I'm sorry, for what ism?
Are cities and towns using Olmsted connections to attract tourism and spur civic revival? Do they say, tourists, come, we got Olmsted parks?
Sure. Well, I think it depends on where you are. I think there's so many different ways you could answer that question. For example, the city of Louisville, the Louisville Olmsted Parks Conservancy, or I should say the Louisville Olmsted Parks Conservancy, has done such a great job of branding the legacy that Louisvillians know there were 3 Olmsteds. So there's a very refined knowledge of the shaping of that city, and it goes beyond the parks. And I think Louisvillians know that they literally shaped everything from the residential subdivisions to the campus grounds and other institutional landscapes. So I would say in a city like Louisville, it is a source of community pride. Now, whether that drives tourism is another question. And the second part I would just say to that is, how do you separate Olmsted from beauty? Biltmore is the #1 tourist attraction in the state of North Carolina. Is it because it was designed by Olmsted and Hunt? Is it because of its scale? Is it because of its sheer extraordinary beauty. Um, I think the important thing is that there's a recognition for Olmsted, with or without an A, preferably without. But I think that many people know of Olmsted, and it is a source of community pride for those that live and work and play in those places.
All right.
Um, did Olmsted ever travel to Europe? And if he did, I'm wondering if he was inspired perhaps by like Hyde Park or some of the Parisian parks. I think Hyde Park was founded by Henry VIII, so it's almost 600 years old.
Well, I mean, Olmsted traveled abroad, yes, and they fostered such travel for their associates. They would actually send people abroad, sometimes for a couple of years, to actually document in photographs and drawings and the like, and bring it back, if you will, teaching people how to see. In the case of Olmsted Senior, his most significant trip was to Birkenhead Park in Liverpool, which was pretty life-changing. I mean, Birkenhead Park really is sort of the predecessor to Central Park as we know it, as a democratic grounds for the working class and for everyone to commingle. So, you know, I would say the big aha moment would have been in Liverpool.
We have another question from David, and he asks, you mentioned Olmsted designs at risk. Which one or two concerns you the most?
So I don't want to trump what we'll put out in the fall for our, and I don't know even if this site will submit. But the place to me that I think, I mean, it's not at risk with a bulldozer, but it needs love. And that is Andrew Jackson Downing Memorial Park in Newberg, New York. It's the only park designed by two generations of Olmsted and Vauxes. So it's Downing Vaux, who was named after A.J. Downing. It's Olmsted Senior and John Charles Olmsted. Warren Manning did the planting plans, and here's a really cool thing. They all did the project pro bono because it was going to be named after Mr. Downing. So that would be a place that I think, and I wanted to say that as an example because people should hear it and know that it's out there. It is a really important early project, and it has a unique series of collaborators. So I would put that high on my list.
Speaking of Biltmore, would you consider that one of those new landscape typologies that you're talking about, the way that it spawned a national forest and all of that? Was that unique, what he did at Biltmore?
Well, I think there's a couple of questions about Biltmore. In terms of it being this kind of grand estate, that would not be, right? We have all those European precedents. But in terms of the cradle of forestry and the work with Gifford Pinchot, that clearly is a level of innovation. I mean, I think you can get into a whole next level of innovation as you start to look at even the horticulture of these places. Think about the Arnold Arboretum. I mentioned Rochester, New York. The pinetum that was planted there with Charles Sprague Sargent was created in case there was an ice storm that ever hit the Arnold as a safety net. So I think there's a lot of innovation, and I would say yes. I think the sheer ambition of the sort of cradle of forestry. But you know, the other thing to me about Biltmore is, at least in the United States, the idea of a 5-mile approach road. I mean, talk about the ultimate fan dance of a seduction, and you know, the ultimate reveal of the house and how long that takes. So, you know, I think there's always nuanced levels of innovation in the work, and I think the forestry piece is definitely groundbreaking. So yeah, I think that, and I also just found out that Pinchot was involved in Shelburne Farms as well in Vermont, and I don't know to what degree. But I think, you know, what we see in all of this work is that this, in a way that the best practitioners today will bring in the best talent for projects. I mean, when we talk about Central Park, for example, we don't talk about George Waring, who was the sanitarian who built the sanitary closet so people can go to the bathroom at Riverside, Illinois, and he made the mall drain. You know, we don't talk about Ignaz Pilat because Olmsted didn't know his plants. And it was Pilat who brought the plants in and the knowledge of those plants. So, you know, there are all of these collaborators, and I think our quest is to tell a bigger story, lift the veil on all of those contributors. So yeah, I think that's a good example of a level of innovation, certainly. Thanks.
Any more questions here? We don't have any more. Julia.
So I just recently reread The Clearing in the Distance by Witold Rybinski. I can't say his name. Charles, you might have to say it. Rybinski. And so it made me, there's so many things about Olmsted's personality. I mean, you needed more time to be able to cover all of that. But I wonder, it made me feel good going back and rereading it and realizing how much the kind of politics, he had to keep fighting against the politics, and how that's such a factor in our lives today. And I was just wondering if there's any particular story that you find especially inspiring, considering like the political mess of our world today.
You can always count on Julia for a really simple question. Wow, Julia, you may have, yeah. I think for me, the whole creation of Central Park and the Herculean task that it was, to me, what I find interesting in the infancy of the profession is I imagine with Senior a lot of conviviality and real sort of heartfelt respect for those that were working before and concurrently with them. I mean, when Downing tragically dies at such a young age, who was positioned to do the Central Park, who was the one that made the Plea, who planted the seeds of the need for it, Olmsted had the good fortune through Calvert Vaux, who Downing brought to the US in 1850. Downing dies in 1852. Vaux asks Olmsted to enter the competition. So he has the good fortune of working on that. H.W.S. Cleveland, who oversees the construction and plantings in much of the South Parks of the Olmsted Vaux plan, he is penniless after the Great Chicago Fire. He is penniless when he dies in 1900, and Olmsted puts up a collection for his tombstone. When Olmsted, as I mentioned, works on Downing Park, they do it for free. And so for me, I think the thing that's most inspiring, because the politics of someone who's been in it, as we all know, in the end, it's great if you're successful, but the process is exhausting and debilitating and gut-wrenching. But I think the part of it for me that I think is so interesting is this camaraderie and respect for each other. And it really feels that because it was a small discipline, that love was extended. And I would say it's meaningful today because we're still a small discipline. We're woefully too small for the need of landscape architects in America. And we see this. There is a tremendous shortage. And so I think that we need to extend that kind of approach to each other and the discipline, because we have a lot of work to do together to really, I think, elevate the discipline to higher levels of impact than it's able to fully realize at this time.
Well, with that, I think we're going to finish up. So I want to thank you for your presentation. It was very thorough. I think when you give such a thorough presentation, the questions don't come as quickly. You answered many of them. But thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. And to you, it's great to see so many people, hear applause, see smiling faces. So thank you for coming. And of course, on Zoom, we'll see you next week. I'll see everybody next week, I hope, on May 17th. Thank you.